Hey guys, tonight we walk into the warm mud brick dusk of ancient Sumer, where reed boats slide through dark canals, temple fires flicker against the flat horizon, and small wedges pressed into clay may or may not be whispering about a relationship far stranger than anything your high school history class ever dared to put on a chalkboard. Some parts of tonight's story are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation. Some parts are calm what-if imagination. Because historians debate where memory ends and myth begins. And because a few old stories have a habit of putting on dramatic robes when nobody's looking. You are stepping into a world of real cities, real rivers, real priests and real tablets. But also into a puzzle where later readers have wondered whether the Anunnaki and the legendary Atlanteans somehow belong in the same dim room. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Also, you probably would not survive this very well. Not because of cursed sea kings, but because Bronze Age sanitation was not exactly a luxury spa experience. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, go ahead and post your location and local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin where the evidence is strongest, on the solid ground, rather than in the mist. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, was one of the earliest places on Earth where urban civilization took durable form. Here in the 4th and 3rd millennia, BCE people gathered into temple-centered settlements, managed irrigation, organized labor, tracked goods, counted grain, and eventually pressed signs into damp clay. Archaeology suggests that this was no fantasy kingdom. This was mud heat, reeds, fish brick, and bureaucracy. Humanity's first great romance with record-keeping begins, like so many grand things, with taxes and storage jars. You can almost feel the place before you understand it. The air carries river damp smoke from cooking fires, and the faint mineral smell of wet clay drying in the evening. Sand grits under your feet. Mosquitoes, those tiny eternal landlords, are already considering your blood a civic resource. Ahead rises a temple platform. Not yet the towering image people later imagine when they hear the word ziggurat, but still impressive enough to remind everyone nearby that gods are expected to have better views than ordinary people. And ordinary people, to be fair, have enough on their minds. Their fields need water at the correct time. Their canals need maintenance. Their herds need counting. Their rulers need obedience. Their gods need feeding, praising, singing, dressing, and the occasional emotional management. Civilization is many things, but one of its earliest talents is creating extra chores with an air of holiness. What's broadly accepted is that the Sumerians left some of the earliest written texts known to us, though writing develops gradually and awkwardly, not all at once like a dramatic movie reveal. No one slams down a tablet and shouts, "Gentlemen, literature." The first marks are practical, lists, goods, labour, measures, but over time the written world expands. Administrative marks become names, names become hymns, hymns become myths, myths become a way of storing not only transactions, but anxieties, identities, and cosmic theories about why the world is arranged in such an inconvenient manner. Among the beings who appear in that written world are the Anunnaki. In Sumerian tradition, the term refers broadly to a group of divine powers associated with the gods, the underworld judgment authority, and cosmic order depending on the text and period. Let me rephrase that more carefully because this is debated. The Anunnaki are not one neat fixed caste list marching identically through every tablet. The evidence we do have points to a flexible religious tradition in which divine names and roles shift across time, city and context. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were originally understood as a specific genealogical group, a broader class of deities, or a label whose meaning changed as myths evolved. That matters because the mystery begins when modern readers approach those old clay tablets with questions the original scribes may never have intended to answer. One interpretation is that stories of gods descending, ordering the world, granting kingship, or interacting with humanity sound uncannily like fragments from a larger and now lost memory. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were not merely mythic deities in the usual ancient sense, but distorted recollections of advanced beings tied somehow to a vanished civilization later called Atlantis. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it binds two very powerful narrative magnets. One is the oldest written civilization. The other is the most famous lost civilization. Put them in the same room, and the internet basically lights a scented candle. Still, we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Atlantis, as a named place, enters surviving literature most clearly through Plato, much later in classical Greece, not in the Sumerian world itself. What's broadly accepted is that there is no direct Sumerian tablet saying, in effect, "Greetings from Atlantis, sorry about the flooding. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so." And here it is thin. Yet thin evidence does not always kill a mystery. Sometimes it feeds it the way a half-heard whisper in a dark hallway is somehow more persuasive than a person calmly speaking in the kitchen. A careful reading might suggest that what later people connect between Sumer and Atlantis is not a direct textual bridge, but a pattern of themes. Very old civilization, divine knowledge, flood destruction, lost golden ages, strange kings, sacred architecture, cultural beginnings that seem to arrive with unnerving speed. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why imaginations begin to hum. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if ancient people preserved memories, not of one literal sunken empire, but of repeated coastal disasters, vanished settlements, and the haunting sense that whole worlds can slip beneath water and leave behind only songs and symbols? That is where your walk begins tonight. Not with certainty, but with layered memory. The Sumerians themselves know floods. Southern Mesopotamia is built on river behaviour, and river behaviour can be moody in the way only water can manage. Water feeds cities, then rearranges them. Water fills canals, then destroys embankments. Water makes kings look competent right up until it does not. Archaeology suggests that flood events did shape settlement histories in the broader region, though not in the tidy one disaster to rule them all style people sometimes prefer. A more cautious explanation could be that later flood myths draw from repeated experiences of environmental instability, not from a single lost super-civilization. But myth does not always preserve experience like a spreadsheet. It preserves mood, fear, awe, loss, the memory of watching the horizon disappear behind weather and water, the feeling that something once stood where now there is only distance. And that is where Atlantis, even before it has a proper name in tonight's story, begins to hover like sea mist at the edge of the reeds. You stand beside a scribe smoothing a fresh tablet. His stylus presses tiny wedge shapes with quick practice movements. He is not writing for you. He is writing for his city, his temple, his economy, his gods. And yet, thousands of years later, you arrive anyway, peering over his shoulder with all the restraint of a tourist in a sacred archive. You want the text to open. You want it to confess. You want the oldest writing in the world to lean close and explain why later ages became so obsessed with divine rulers, drowned lands and civilizations that feel both impossibly ancient and suspiciously advanced. It does not do that, not directly. That's the frustrating charm of it. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Somewhere ahead lie temple cities, flood memories, priestly sky-watching king lists, and stories that later readers would stretch toward the ocean. For now, though, you remain on the riverbank, listening to frogs in the reeds, watching the last light fade over the plain, while the oldest clay in history begins very quietly to pull you toward deeper water. The dust settles more fully now, and the river plain begins to feel less like a map and more like a breathing thing, wide and dark and endlessly patient. You move deeper into the early world of Sumer, where the reeds whisper in the night wind and the first cities rise from mud, as if the earth itself has decided to start keeping records. Most historians agree that Sumerian civilization, especially in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, gives us some of the earliest durable traces of urban life, organised religion and writing. What's broadly accepted is that these communities did not appear out of nowhere in one theatrical burst of genius. They grew from earlier village cultures, from long adaptation to wetlands and river channels from human beings, doing what human beings always do when survival gets repetitive enough, inventing administration. You can picture the process, though it is less glamorous than later legends would prefer. People dig, canals patch walls, stack bricks, count barley, curse the weather, praise the gods, and discover very slowly that a city is just 1,000 small inconveniences with a temple in the middle. There is your first light joke of the night, and frankly the Sumerians have earned it. Civilization is often presented as a shining dawn. In practice, it also involves mud in places mud should never be. Yet something remarkable is happening here. The evidence we do have points to communities beginning to think in larger, more organised ways about power, sacred order, and time itself. When later Sumerian traditions speak of kingship descending from heaven, they are expressing a view of political authority that feels larger than any single ruler. This is not just a mayor with better sandals. This is the idea that order legitimacy and cosmic permission are linked. One interpretation is that such phrases preserve a worldview in which civilization itself feels granted almost delivered from above. And that is where the mist begins to gather again around the story you are following. A careful reading might suggest that later readers, especially those fascinated by Atlantis, find these heavenly descents and sacred foundations suspiciously resonant. Not because the Sumerians ever plainly say our cousins from the ocean stopped by with superior architecture, but because the emotional shape of the stories feels familiar. Ancient wisdom, divine intermediaries, floods, loss, beginnings that seem almost too grand for the humble tools of early cities. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the bridge between Sumer and Atlantis is not one explicit sentence, but a mood of remembered greatness. Still, we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Archaeology suggests that early Mesopotamian cities emerged through local development, not through evidence of a vanished overseas civilization stepping in with magical blueprints. Eridu, Uruk-Ur and other sites reflect gradual change, adaptation, and increasing complexity in the alluvial plains of southern Iraq. There is no full consensus on every detail of how these transitions unfolded, but the mainstream view is clear enough. People in this region built their own urban world through labour innovation and long continuity with earlier settlements. That may sound less romantic than crystal towers rising from the sea, but honestly, real irrigation engineering is its own kind of epic. It also has the advantage of actually existing. You wander in thought toward the memory of flood stories, because water keeps waiting just beyond the torchlight. Flooding is not a side note in Mesopotamia. It is part of the emotional furniture. Rivers give life, and rivers revise their decisions. Archaeology suggests that environmental shifts, local floods, and the vulnerabilities of low-lying settlements were serious realities for ancient communities. A more cautious explanation could be that flood myths in Mesopotamia arise from repeated experiences of watery disruption later shaped into sacred narrative. That is documented ground, or at least close to it. But the human mind is never content to leave disaster at the scale of a field or a village. It expands. It embellishes. It asks what came before this ruined thing, and whether something greater was lost. Historians still argue whether ancient flood traditions preserve memories of specific regional events, broader cultural anxieties, or mythic patterns not tied neatly to any one catastrophe. That exact uncertainty is one reason the Atlantis idea keeps wandering into the room wearing someone else's mythology like a borrowed cloak. A fringe idea proposes that stories of pre-flood kings, divine beings, and lost order hint at a much older civilization, perhaps maritime, perhaps advanced in ways now distorted by time, that influenced later cultures from the edges of memory. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals because pre-flood imagery has a peculiar gravity. You hear that phrase pre-flood, and suddenly history stops behaving like history and starts behaving like the opening paragraph of a very dramatic diary. Even if the evidence is thin, the emotional suggestion is strong. What if there really was a before, not just before your city, but before cities as you think you know them? If we stay careful, there is another route to that feeling. Coastlines around the world have shifted over long spans of time. Sea levels rose significantly after the last ice age, and ancient human communities living near old shorelines would have seen landscapes transformed. Most historians agree that such environmental changes are real and important, though linking them directly to any one legend is far more difficult. One interpretation is that later myths of drowned lands might preserve in softened and mythologized form memories of habitats lost to encroaching seas. That does not get you cleanly to Atlantis, and it definitely does not get you from Atlantis to the Anunnaki in one tidy leap, but it does give you a human mechanism for why stories of vanished worlds are so stubborn. You imagine a shoreline now gone, not a marble fantasy city with glowing domes, but fishing camps, ritual places, maybe trading posts, maybe villages whose names are lost because wet places do not preserve archives politely. The sea moves in. Generations later the memory remains, but the details blur. A drowned inlet becomes a lost district. A lost district becomes a lost kingdom. A lost kingdom becomes, after enough retellings and enough moonlit exaggeration, the kind of civilization that later audiences cannot resist giving very dramatic architecture. Humanity has never met a vague ruin it did not immediately try to upgrade. Back in Sumer, the clay remains stubbornly terrestrial. The people here are not writing oceanic memoirs. They are composing hymns, myths, king traditions, administrative records, and ritual texts shaped by a riverine world. Yet riverine worlds and maritime legends can touch in the imagination because both are ruled by water's unreliable mercy. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a secret alliance between named Atlanteans and named Sumerian gods, but a deeper human habit of linking origins with places that are no longer reachable. You pause outside a temple enclosure where oil lamps flicker against plastered walls. Somewhere nearby, a worker mutters under his breath while hauling supplies, which is reassuring. History is full of grand claims, but also of extremely tired labourers. Above the stars emerge one by one, and the city seems to lean under them like a listener. One interpretation is that the earliest urban cultures already lived with a powerful sense that order came from beyond the ordinary human world, whether through God's cosmic rhythm or sacred inheritance. If later ages imagined Atlantis as another source of lost order, perhaps that is why the two-story systems seem to reach for each other across time. That is a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. The mystery is not that a tablet tells you exactly what to think. The mystery is that early civilization leaves behind fragments so compelling that later minds keep arranging them into larger patterns. You continue forward with the frogs still singing in the dark canals, the smell of clay still fresh in the air, and the soft suspicion that before the kings, before the tablets, and maybe even before the flood, stories hardened into text. Something about water and memory had already begun shaping the human dream of what was lost. The stars sharpen overhead, and the city seems to settle into its night rhythms, though in Sumer night never quite means silence. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere a jar breaks and inspires immediate regret. Somewhere a priest clears his throat with the deep seriousness of a man who would very much like the gods to notice his scheduling efforts. You keep moving through this early sacred landscape where the old stories do not merely describe the world, but arrange it, giving names to powers behind storm fertility, kingship judgment, and the uneasy bargain between human labour and divine expectation. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion was richly polytheistic, with different cities centering their devotion on particular gods, while also sharing broader mythic traditions. What's broadly accepted is that divine power in Mesopotamia was not abstract in the modern sense. It was personal, local, cosmic, administrative, emotional, and sometimes alarmingly high maintenance. Gods could bless cities, punish rulers, authorize kingship, floodlands, protect walls, and generally make it clear that the universe was not operating as a relaxed, open-plan arrangement. The Anunnaki appear within this larger divine world, though, as always, not with the neat consistency that later myth builders would prefer. A careful reading might suggest that the ancient scribes were less interested in giving you a tidy theological handbook than in preserving layers of inherited tradition. In some texts, the Anunnaki are associated with major divine powers, cosmic order, or the underworld. In others, their role feels more diffuse. The evidence we do have points to a category of important divine beings whose identity shifts across period and context. Let me rephrase that more carefully. If you are hoping for one tablet where a polite ancient scholar writes, "The Anunnaki are exactly 7 individuals here," are their resumes, and please ignore future confusion, you are going to be disappointed. Ancient religion rarely respects modern filing systems. Still, the phrase itself has a gravity that later readers find irresistible. The gods who came down, the gods of high rank, the beings associated with heaven judgment, and the ordering of the world. One interpretation is that these stories express how early people imagined the origins of authority and culture. Another interpretation, especially in modern fringe writing, is that the Anunnaki were remembered not simply as deities, but as advanced visitors, culture bringers, or rulers from a civilization older than Sumer itself. A fringe idea proposes that these beings were linked in some distant inherited memory to the same legendary sphere of lost wisdom later attached to Atlantis. This theory isn't widely accepted, but you can see why it catches fire. Divine descent and drowned greatness make excellent dramatic neighbours. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian divine narratives emerge from local religious development over long periods, shaped by priesthoods, cities, politics, and oral tradition. There is no accepted historical evidence that actual Atlanteans are hiding behind Sumerian gods, like stagehands behind a temple curtain. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here again, it is thin. But the interpretive temptation remains, because ancient myths often describe knowledge, kingship, and order as coming from above or beyond ordinary human life. You pass a carved doorway and imagine the stories spoken inside voices, low in lamplight, as offering smoke gently upward. The world of the gods is not far away to the Sumerian imagination. Heaven is active. The divine assembly has opinions. Human kings rule only with permission, and cities thrive only if the gods remain in a cooperative mood. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian texts repeatedly frame civilization itself as dependent on divine structure. Temples, rites, laws, sacred offices, and kingship are part of a cosmic arrangement, not merely social convenience. One interpretation is that this makes civilization feel almost imported, as though culture is something received before it is mastered. And now Atlantis begins to shimmer again at the edge of your thoughts. Not because the tablets say its name, but because later readers love a source. They want a first teacher, a vanished mother civilization, a place from which architecture, astronomy, kingship, or sacred science supposedly spread outward in half-remembered form. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then one reason some people connect the Anunnaki to Atlanteans is simple. Both occupy the role of origin donors in modern imagination. Both seem older than the civilizations that remember them. Both are associated in different ways with power that feels half divine and half cultural. The resemblance may be thematic rather than historical, but themes are powerful little smugglers. They carry ideas across centuries without passports. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian divine descent language should be read primarily as political theology, mythic cosmology, ritual tradition, or symbolic storytelling whose meanings changed over time. That debate matters because once you read divine descent symbolically, the phrase opens. Coming down from heaven could mean literal mythic action in the worldview of believers. It could also express the sense that law, kingship, and sacred order are not inventions you casually make up on a Tuesday afternoon. They are perceived as prior weighty and beyond human whim. A more cautious explanation could be that later audiences mistake this symbolic richness for disguised reportage. Still, symbols do not arise in a vacuum. The Sumerians live in a landscape where horizons are broad and skies feel enormous. Storms arrive with theatrical timing. River floods alter fate. Star patterns govern ritual calendars. Priests and rulers alike seek alignment with powers they cannot control. In such a world, saying that the gods came down is not strange at all. It is almost practical. The invisible is always pressing against the visible here. The canal glints in moonlight. The temple brick still radiates the day's heat. The stars seem close enough to draft a legal complaint against. A popular rumour claims that if the Anunnaki were culture bearers in myth, then perhaps Atlantis was the earthly home of that sacred knowledge later drowned and mythologized into separate traditions. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here is not a direct document, but a repeated human pattern. When cultures explain their greatness, they often reach upward toward gods or backward toward a lost age. Sometimes they do both at once, which is wonderfully efficient from a storytelling perspective. Why settle for one mystery when you can have a deluxe package? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The tablets tell you the Sumerians imagined divine hierarchies, sacred order, and gods closely involved with human affairs. That is documented ground. The leap from there to Atlantean inheritance is interpretation layered over interpretation, and in many cases gentle imagination wearing antique jewellery. Yet as you continue through the sleeping city, hearing sandals scuff dust and distant reeds hiss along the riverbank, you begin to understand why later minds could not resist the connection. What if these old stories are not preserving a secret history of ocean empires, but the much older human feeling that civilization arrived like a gift from somewhere just beyond reach? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The priests know the gods are near. The scribes know the clay must hold the names correctly. The rulers know legitimacy depends on more than force. And you walking softly through the oldest literate night on earth know that once people start telling stories about beings who descend from above to shape the world below, there will always be someone somewhere ready to ask whether they came, not only from heaven, but from a land now swallowed by the sea. You drift farther south now in your mind toward the marshy edges of the old Mesopotamian world, where land and water never seem to settle their argument, and where one of the earliest sacred cities begins to shimmer out of mud and memory, Eridu. The name itself feels quiet, almost secretive, as though it belongs to a place that would rather be found at dawn than announced at noon. Most historians agree that Eridu was one of the earliest important settlements in southern Mesopotamia, and that it held deep religious significance, especially in connection with the god Enki, later called Ea, in Akkadian traditions. Archaeology suggests that the site shows long occupations stretching deep into prehistory, with successive temple structures built one atop another like careful layers of devotion. That detail matters more than it first appears to. You are not looking at a city that blazed into existence overnight with suspiciously polished mystery civilization glamour. You are looking at accumulated time, mud brick, rebuilding, ritual repetition. The evidence we do have points to continuity, not magic. A shrine becomes a larger shrine, which becomes a temple, which becomes part of a sacred landscape whose significance grows because people keep returning to it. Civilization, once again, looks less like a single grand reveal and more like generations of people saying, in effect, well, we're already here, so we may as well build something holy. And yet Eridu has a mood that invites larger thoughts. It stands near the watery margins of southern Mesopotamia, close to marshes and former shorelines, in a region where the line between dry ground and open water could shift over long spans of time. One interpretation is that this liminal setting helped make Eridu feel like a place of beginnings, a threshold between worlds where sacred order first rose from the deep uncertainty of the wetlands. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamians saw certain cities as foundational in mythic terms, and Eridu often carries that early prestige. It is not merely old, it feels first. That feeling is where later imagination begins to tug at the sleeve again. A fringe idea proposes that if Eridu was remembered as an origin city near ancient waters, then perhaps it preserves some echo, however faint or distorted, of an even earlier tradition tied to a lost maritime civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a certain dreamlike pull. If later people wanted to imagine a surviving cousin of Atlantis, a place not sunk but standing at the edge of the memory, Eridu would make a very tempting candidate. Not because archaeology says so, it does not, but because old temple cities beside ancient waters are exactly the sort of places that attract stories the way lamplight attracts moths and very determined insects. You can see the city at evening. Reed beds tremble in the breeze. Pools hold the last of the sky's light. Birds move low over the marshes. The temple rises from the flat landscape, not like a mountain, because there are no mountains here to imitate, but like intention made visible. Around it stretch houses, workspaces, storage areas, small courtyards, and all the ordinary architecture of survival. The sacred does not float above daily life in some glowing bubble. It sits beside grinding stones, fish baskets, damp reeds, and the deeply unromantic problem of keeping walls standing in a wet environment. Ancient holiness, as it turns out, also needs maintenance. The gods may be eternal, but the bricks absolutely are not. Most historians agree that Enki, the god strongly associated with Eridu, is one of the most intriguing figures in Mesopotamian tradition. He is linked with wisdom, fresh water craft magic, and the subterranean sweet waters called the Abzu. A careful reading might suggest that his character makes Eridu feel even more like a city poised between practical life and something older, deeper, stranger, fresh water beneath the earth. Sacred knowledge, creation, technical skill, cleverness. If later readers wanted to build a bridge from Sumerian myth to Atlantean possibility, Enki's watery and wisdom-rich profile would be hard to resist. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether the symbolic geography of places like Eridu should be read mainly through ritual and theology, through ecology and settlement history, or through a blend of both. The mainstream view does not require Atlantis, and frankly, it manages quite well without it. Eridu's sacred status can be understood within Mesopotamian religion itself. Its watery associations arise naturally in a delta environment where water is both life and threat. Its antiquity reflects real settlement history. Its mythic prestige grows because early cities loved nothing more than claiming they were first, except perhaps claiming the gods personally approved their zoning plan. Still, water has its own persuasive power over the imagination. The Abzu in Mesopotamian thought is not just any water, it is deep, generative, hidden, the source beneath appearances. One interpretation is that later readers see in this an almost uncanny resonance with the idea of a lost civilization beneath or beyond the sea, a wisdom realm submerged but not entirely gone. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then perhaps Eridu becomes attractive in Atlantean theories, not because it is Atlantis, but because it shares the emotional architecture of Atlantis. Water, origins, sacred knowledge, a place older than memory feels comfortable admitting. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Archaeology suggests temple rebuilding at Eridu across long periods. What's broadly accepted is that the site matters enormously for understanding early Mesopotamian religion. What cannot be confirmed is any direct historical link between Eridu and Plato's later Atlantis tradition. The gap is real. The chronology is real. The cultural distance is real. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Yet the human appetite for connecting old waters to older wisdom remains surprisingly energetic. Put a sacred city near a marsh, and someone eventually will decide it was either the cradle of civilization or a branch office of a lost sea empire. As you move through the imagined streets, you hear the small sounds of a place that does not know it is becoming legendary. A child drags something wooden across packed earth. Someone laughs behind a wall. Fish scales glint faintly near a work area. The temple attendants move with practiced quiet. Above the stars gather in the same patient patterns that later priests will study and later dreamers will over-interpret with great enthusiasm. For the people here, Eridu is not an abstract puzzle. It is home shrine obligation and sacred centre. But to you coming from much later ages soaked in myths of Atlantis, it has another quality too. It stands at the edge of marsh and settlement, at the edge of archaeology and legend, at the edge of what is documented and what is only suggested. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What if the first temple city was later remembered, not in a direct line, but in a blurred, emotional inheritance, as the kind of place from which all wisdom once flowed? What if the story is pointing at something else, not a sunken continent, but the recurring human instinct to place origins near water, as though creation itself prefers a shoreline? The wind moves softly across the reeds again. The lamps burn lower. Eridu remains where it has always been, on the solid ground of history, and also on the trembling boundary where history starts to feel like a dream. And as you leave its sacred edge behind, the idea lingers that perhaps the most powerful relationship between the Anunnaki and any imagined Atlanteans is not a literal alliance, but a shared setting in the oldest theatre of all water memory, and the suspicion that the first great truths always rose from somewhere half submerged. The night opens wider above you now, and with Eridu fading gently behind your attention, lifts from the marshes to the sky. This is one of the oldest habits in human history. When the land is uncertain, when rivers shift, when kings brag too much, when harvests depend on timing that no one fully controls, you look up. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian priests and scholars paid close attention to the heavens, especially in later periods, when astronomical observation became increasingly systematic. Though even in early Sumer, the sky already carried sacred importance. What's broadly accepted is that stars, planets, moon phases, and celestial patterns were woven into religion, ritual, timing, kingship, and the general sense that the universe had a structure whether human beings deserved to understand it or not. You can feel why the sky mattered here. The plane is so open that the heavens seem less like a ceiling and more like a second landscape. Darkness settles over the canals, and the stars rise with the calm confidence of things that have never once needed to explain themselves. A priest stands on a platform watching, not because he is doing amateur stargazing for personal enrichment, but because celestial order means something practical and sacred. Timekeeping omens, festival timing, divine communication, royal legitimacy, all of it brushes against the sky. Civilization below is fragile. The heavens above look annoyingly organized. One interpretation is that this habit of linking wisdom with the stars helped later mystery traditions imagine a hidden inheritance stretching across lost civilizations. A careful reading might suggest that because Mesopotamian religious knowledge often seems both practical and cosmic, later readers became tempted to ask whether such knowledge was itself inherited from some earlier source, perhaps one now vanished. A fringe idea proposes that Atlantean wisdom survived not through monuments under the sea, but through priestly traditions, star lore, sacred geometry, and mythic memory passed into later cultures. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has that wonderfully dramatic quality people enjoy at 2 a.m. when they should really be sleeping. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian astronomy and omen literature developed within the civilizations of Mesopotamia through long local traditions of observation, record-keeping, and priestly interpretation. There is no accepted evidence of an Atlantean syllabus drifting into Uruk in a waterproof box. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and once again it is thin. But what later generations notice is the aura of inherited knowledge. Priests know things, temple libraries preserve things. The sky seems to speak in patterns. That combination is exactly the kind of material out of which later mythmakers build secret lineages. You walk through a temple courtyard where the warm smell of oil lamps mixes with dust and old brick. Somewhere nearby, reeds rustle in the dark, and a scribe carries a tablet as carefully as if it contains the schedule of the universe, which in a way it might. In Mesopotamian thought, knowledge is not always a casual human hobby. It is bound to divine order. Enki, lord of wisdom and deep waters, hovers, again at the edge of this atmosphere associated with craft intelligence, subtle power, and the mysterious deep source beneath visible things. Most historians agree that such divine figures helped ancient people imagine where skill and order ultimately came from. One interpretation is that this made sacred knowledge feel less invented than received. And that matters to your Atlantean question, because Atlantis, in later imagination, is rarely just a place. It is a source, a lost origin of advanced knowledge, perhaps moral, perhaps technological, perhaps spiritual, depending on which storyteller is currently having the most dramatic afternoon. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the connection some people imagine between the Anunnaki and Atlanteans may rest less on geography and more on function. Both appear in modern speculative readings as carriers of order knowledge and civilizational patterning. Both seem to stand just before recorded memory fully turns on the lights. Historians still argue whether ancient skywatching in Mesopotamia should be understood mainly as religious practice, political technology, proto-scientific observation, or all three at once. That exact uncertainty keeps the old stories alive. Because once you admit that the priests were observing carefully and thinking symbolically at the same time, the whole thing becomes rather attractive to anyone hunting for hidden wisdom. The mainstream explanation could be that cultures dependent on seasonal cycles naturally develop sophisticated attention to the heavens. A more cautious explanation could be that later people romanticize this into a secret wisdom tradition because spreadsheets are less glamorous than prophecies. Still, it is hard not to be charmed. The stars reflect faintly in canal water. The temple platform catches moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a musician plucks a string instrument, and the sound hangs in the air like a thread pulled through the dark. You imagine the priests tracking the moon, marking seasonal changes, aligning rituals, building a world in which the sky and city answer one another. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if later Atlantis theories attach themselves to Mesopotamian star lore, because both express the same longing that somewhere once people understood the cosmos more beautifully than we do? A popular rumour claims that the shared focus on celestial knowledge across many ancient cultures must point back to one vanished source civilization. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the clue here is emotional rather than conclusive. Human beings repeatedly associate wisdom with the stars. Lost civilizations, real or imagined, are almost always granted excellent astronomy, the way heroic kings are always granted surprisingly good hair. It is less evidence than expectation. We want the ancient wise ones to have looked up and known things, preferably while wearing robes and saying memorable lines. The evidence we do have points to something both humbler and more impressive. Ancient Mesopotamians built knowledge patiently, observation by observation, ritual by ritual, record by record. What's broadly accepted is that their learned traditions became foundational for later developments in the ancient Near East. That alone is enough to make them extraordinary. You do not need Atlantis to explain why organised skywatching matters in one of the world's earliest civilizations. But if a later imagination wanted to see in this a surviving ember from some older drowned world, you can understand the temptation. The stars feel ancient enough to belong to everyone and to no one. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamia watched the sky and bound that watching to sacred order. The interpretation is that this made knowledge feel inherited from a source beyond ordinary humanity. The imagined part is the soft possibility that somewhere in the long rising and falling of seas, some older shoreline people also watched these same stars and passed their awe forward until it took root in temple cities of clay. The frogs are still calling in the canals. The smell of wet earth remains. The same night wind that moves the marsh grass brushes your skin as you look upward, with the priests, with the scribes, with every person who has ever hoped the heavens were trying to say something kind. And as the constellations turn slowly over the old plain, you begin to suspect that if the Anunnaki and the Atlanteans ever meet in the human imagination, they meet here first under a sky so orderly and so distant that it makes every civilization feel like a brief attempt to remember a pattern that was already there. The stars fade slowly, as if the sky itself is reluctant to surrender them. And somewhere beyond the temple walls, the first dull light begins to soften the horizon. You remain in the same old world, but now everything turns toward water again. It always does. In Mesopotamia, water is never merely scenery. It is road blessing threat, wealth, hunger, memory, and mood. Most historians agree that flood traditions were deeply important across the ancient Near East, and Mesopotamia preserves some of the oldest written flood narratives we possess. What's broadly accepted is that these stories do not appear in a vacuum. They emerge from societies living in intimate dependence on rivers that could nourish fields one season and ruin them the next. You can picture the plain, before sunrise, low and still reeds whispering at the edges of channels, damp air pressing against the skin. Somewhere a farmer is already awake because agriculture has always been an industry with absolutely no respect for sleeping in. The canals reflect a pale strip of sky, mud clings to sandals, birds lift off the marsh in abrupt dark bursts. It is beautiful, yes, but it is the kind of beauty that can become a regional emergency with very little notice. A river does not care about your plans. Water is history's least cooperative co-author. Archaeology suggests that ancient Mesopotamian communities repeatedly faced environmental instability, shifting river courses, local flooding, and the constant need to manage water carefully. The evidence we do have points to a world in which flood was not one isolated nightmare, but a recurring possibility built into life itself. One interpretation is that over generations, those repeated experiences shaped a powerful cultural imagination of watery judgment and survival. Not every flood story needs to preserve one single global event. A more cautious explanation could be that the great narratives grow out of many smaller disasters layered and magnified until they take on cosmic scale. And yet, flood stories are rarely content to remain local. That is part of their strange power. Once water enters myth, it tends to arrive wearing universal ambitions. It erases boundaries, it humbles kings, it puts ordinary people and sacred institutions on the same trembling footing. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian flood traditions preserve memory of specific historical floods, broader environmental anxieties, or mythic motifs shaped primarily by religious meaning. That uncertainty matters because it opens a door. Not a wide door perhaps, but enough for Atlantis to drift in like sea fog. A popular rumour claims that all ancient flood stories must point back to one enormous lost catastrophe, perhaps involving a drowned civilization so advanced and so tragic that cultures across the world kept dim memories of it. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because flood myths feel too emotionally large to some people to belong only to river management gone wrong. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then Atlantis becomes less a specific Greek literary invention and more a convenient label for humanity's recurring dream of a world swallowed whole. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian flood traditions are real literary traditions preserved in ancient texts. Plato's Atlantis is much later and emerges in a very different cultural and philosophical context. There is no accepted historical chain neatly connecting them. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here it is, thin. But the emotional bridge is easy to understand. Flood stories ask the same aching question no matter where they appear. What was there before the waters rose? You walk beside a canal embankment where workers inspect damp brick and patched earth. Their labour is not glamorous, but it is the sort of labour on which civilizations embarrassingly depend. Somewhere in the distance, an ox snorts. Somewhere else, someone is already annoyed with the leaking structure, proving that infrastructure complaints are one of humanity's most stable cultural traditions. The temple stands behind you still and watchful. Ahead lies open lowland, a place where one good flood can feed a region and one bad flood can rearrange all your confidence. One interpretation is that later readers connect the Anunnaki to Atlanteans through this watery threshold. In Mesopotamian myths, divine beings often stand near the great turning points of order and catastrophe. They authorize, judge, instruct, or witness. In later speculative imagination, Atlanteans become another kind of pre-catastrophe people associated with lost greatness before the waters close over them. Both story systems, though, very different in origin, circle the same emotional terrain, a world before ruin, a rupture, and a lingering suspicion that something valuable vanished beneath the surface. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not one literal drowned empire sending ambassadors to Sumer, but a deep human habit of attaching wisdom to what was lost in water. Water hides without fully erasing. Land swallowed by sea still exists somewhere, even if unreachable. That is psychologically irresistible. A burned city becomes ash. A drowned city becomes mystery. The ocean keeps secrets in a way deserts can only envy. Most historians agree that many ancient flood stories function not only as disaster memory, but also as moral, theological, and political reflection. Floods in myth can reset the world, expose human fragility, and dramatise the dependence of survival on divine favour or clever obedience. A careful reading might suggest that what people later find Atlantean in these narratives is not a coded map, but a mood of lost magnificence. The farther back a disaster is placed, the more room imagination has to furnish the drowned houses. You imagine generations telling and retelling such stories. A bad flood becomes the flood. A drowned district becomes the lost city. A lost city becomes a vanished age. Then later, writers, readers, mystics, and enthusiastic people with dramatically underlined notebooks begin linking all flood tales together into one grand submerged prehistory. Humanity has never met a body of water without immediately wondering what it might be hiding. Usually fish, sometimes regret, occasionally entire philosophical systems. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know Mesopotamian people lived with real flood risk. We know they preserved powerful flood narratives. We know later civilizations also imagined drowned lands and lost golden ages. What cannot be confirmed is that these traditions all descend from one literal Atlantean catastrophe. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, and the more careful you become, the more interesting the puzzle actually gets, because uncertainty leaves space for atmosphere. The light strengthens now over the plain. Water channels gleam pale silver. The frogs quiet down. Temple smoke begins to rise in thin lines. The city is waking, but the old flood memory does not sleep. It sits beneath the streets, beneath the hymns, beneath the king lists yet to come, like groundwater under clay. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamia knew flood and wrote it into sacred story. The interpretation is that later people saw in those stories the echo of something larger. The imagined part is the soft haunting possibility that every time the rivers rose in Sumer, they stirred not only local fear, but the oldest human intuition of all, that somewhere under the water lies a lost world still waiting to be remembered. Morning gathers gently over the plain, and with the light comes one of the oldest and strangest documents ever pressed into clay, the king list. You do not hold it in your hands yet, but you can feel its presence approaching, because the logic of early civilization always seems to drift toward one irresistible question: who ruled first? Not just who ruled last week, or who currently has the most impressive hat, but who stood at the beginning when order was young, and the world still seemed close enough to the gods to smell of it. Most historians agree that the Sumerian king list is a fascinating blend of political tradition, mythic memory, and historical material, preserving names of dynasties and rulers, while also presenting impossibly long reigns in its earliest sections. What's broadly accepted is that it cannot be read as straightforward history from top to bottom, yet it cannot be dismissed as mere fantasy either. That mixed quality is exactly what gives it its sleepy, haunted charm. The list begins in a world before the familiar rhythm of normal human lifespans. Kings reign not for decades, but for spans so vast they feel geological. Thousands of years, tens of thousands depending on the recension and translation. A careful reading might suggest that such numbers are symbolic, political, theological, or literary, rather than literal. A more cautious explanation could be that the list is constructing an image of sacred antiquity, placing the earliest kings in a time qualitatively different from ordinary history. If later readers hear those immense reigns and think of lost golden ages, you can hardly blame them. Human beings have always treated deep antiquity the way people treat old family recipes. The details get fuzzier, and somehow the original version becomes more magnificent every generation. You walk now through the city as officials begin their day. Storage courtyards open. Donkeys complain with admirable honesty. A scribe wets clay, smooths a surface, and prepares to set down names that matter because names organise memory. Kingship in Mesopotamia is never just administration. It is legitimacy, divine favour, sacred burden, and public theatre all at once. The evidence we do have points to a world where political order was imagined as descending from beyond ordinary human invention. In the king list itself, kingship descends from heaven. That phrase is one of those ancient lines that instantly begins attracting modern speculation like a magnet under a table. One interpretation is that the phrase simply expresses political theology. Authority is sacred because it is not merely human. Rule is legitimate because it participates in cosmic order. That reading makes excellent sense within Mesopotamian religion, but a fringe idea proposes that such language might preserve, however faintly, memory of an earlier civilizing force, perhaps divine in story, but historical in origin, that established kingship after some great disruption. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it becomes even more tempting when placed beside flood traditions. A world destroyed, a world rebuilt, kingship restored. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the earliest rulers begin to look less like bureaucrats and more like survivors, standing on the edge of catastrophe trying to reassemble order from the wreckage. Historians still argue whether the earliest sections of the Sumerian king list should be read mainly as ideological construction, as mythic framing for later political claims, or as very distant echoes of older memories shaped beyond recognition. That debate matters because it sits right at the edge of your bigger question. If the earliest kings are symbolic, then Atlantis stays outside the room. If the earliest kings preserve distorted memory, then all sorts of theories start creeping along the floorboards in soft slippers. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. There is no accepted evidence that the pre-flood kings of Mesopotamian tradition were Atlanteans, emissaries of Atlantis, or descendants of a drowned ocean empire. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin, but the shape of the story continues to tug. Before the flood, a line of rulers exists in a world almost too old to imagine properly. Then catastrophe breaks time in two. Afterward, kingship appears again among cities you can place on the map. That narrative pattern is emotionally powerful. It divides history into a before and after a lost age and a recovered order. Atlantis theories love exactly that sort of architecture. You can almost hear the mythic silence around those earliest names, Alulim, Alangar, Enmenluana. They sound less like ordinary rulers and more like stones dropped into a deep well. Each name vanishes downward into time, and the numbers attached to them only deepen the effect. Most historians agree that the exaggerated reign lengths are not reliable chronological data in any modern sense, but one interpretation is that they communicate status rather than duration. The earliest kings belong to an age closer to divine order, more stable, more potent, more grand. Their very length of rule says this was a different world. Not necessarily a better one, though. Old texts like Old Uncles do enjoy glorifying the past. And here, Atlantis reappears, not as geography, but as emotional mirror. In Plato's later story, Atlantis is also a world set apart from ordinary time, a place of exceptional power and organised greatness before downfall. A popular rumour claims that all such Golden Age traditions must point to one real prehistoric civilization remembered under different names. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The clue here is structural. Lost age, great rulers, catastrophe, diminished present. Human cultures repeat this pattern because it explains too much, too elegantly. It turns the confusion of history into a moral landscape. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if these king lists are not preserving a hidden chronicle of Atlantean dynasts, but a more universal truth about human memory? The farther back you go, the larger things become. The first kings are taller in imagination, wiser in retrospect, more sanctioned by heaven, more deeply rooted in order. Catastrophe then breaks that perfection, and everything after feels smaller. That does not require Atlantis. But if you already carry Atlantis in your imagination, the resemblance hums. The city around you is entirely practical in the least mystical ways. Men argue over deliveries. Someone drops a basket. Someone else blames someone not currently present, a custom that appears in every civilization with impressive consistency. Yet the texts these people leave behind do something more than track grain and labour. They stage memory. They place their own cities in a story that begins before measurable history and resumes after flood. What's broadly accepted is that this helps legitimize current rulers by placing them in a sacred continuum. A careful reading might suggest that it also reflects the deep human need to believe that order can return after disaster. That may be the most haunting bridge of all between the Anunnaki and imagined Atlanteans. Not secret bloodlines, not hidden maps, not underwater palaces with suspiciously polished columns. Instead, the bridge may be catastrophe followed by authority. Divine beings or culture bringers stand near the beginning. Catastrophe interrupts, and afterward kingship comes back, as though history itself has been restarted under supervision. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. But the resemblance is enough to keep later imaginations busy for centuries. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian king traditions preserve pre-flood rulers with extraordinary reigns and a sacred view of kingship. The interpretation is that these stories create the memory of a lost golden age. The imagined part is the quiet possibility that every ancient list of first rulers carries somewhere between the numbers and the names the aftertaste of a disaster so deep that people could only rebuild the world by first enlarging the memory of what came before. The sun climbs higher now, and with the daylight, the old cities lose a little of their ghostly charm and become what they also truly are: built places, engineered places, worked places. The mystery does not vanish in daylight, but it has to share the road with brickmakers, canal diggers, carpenters, potters, and the deeply unpoetic reality that civilizations are mostly held together by people who are tired before lunch. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian societies achieved remarkable things in architecture, irrigation craft, production, administration, and urban planning without any need for a lost ocean empire to explain them. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian civilization was extraordinary on its own terms, shaped by human labour, local innovation and long continuity with earlier communities in the region. You walk through one of these cities in full morning now, and the practical brilliance of it becomes impossible to ignore. Walls rise in sun-dried brick. Streets and passages form channels of movement between homes, courtyards, workshops, and sacred precincts. Storage facilities hold grain and goods. Canals do the unglamorous but essential work of making large settlements possible in a difficult environment. Temple complexes gather labour offerings, accounting, and authority into one organised knot. Archaeology suggests that these places were not clumsy first drafts of civilization. They were adaptive, sophisticated systems built by people who understood their landscape well enough to survive in it and imaginative enough to reshape it. That is the documented ground. And it matters because the more impressive the real Sumerians become, the less useful Atlantis ought to be as an explanatory shortcut. You do not need a vanished super civilization to account for why people in southern Mesopotamia learned to organise irrigation, standardise labour, build monumental temples, or develop long-distance exchange. A more cautious explanation could be that complexity emerges where environment, population administration, and belief start reinforcing one another over time. It is less cinematic than crystal-powered sea engineers arriving with blueprints, but it has the enormous advantage of fitting the evidence. Still, human beings are famously bad at resisting unnecessary embellishment. A fringe idea proposes that whenever a very ancient culture seems impressively accomplished, the simplest answer cannot possibly be that ancient people were clever, observant, and hard-working. No, it must be a lost source, a hidden teacher, a vanished predecessor. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it pops up again and again because many people find it easier to imagine a missing master civilization than to accept that mud brick cities full of ordinary humans could achieve so much. Ancient people in this kind of storytelling are often treated like they require mysterious consultants, which is honestly a little rude. The evidence we do have points to a Sumerian world full of highly effective techniques and institutional habits, standardized bricks, organized storage, specialized labor, religious architecture tied to political identity, artisans capable of fine work in stone, metal, shell, and clay. Most historians agree that the temple economy and urban framework of Mesopotamia arose through local development, even if outside contacts and trade mattered too. One interpretation is that later Atlantis theories latch on to Sumerian achievements, because very early sophistication can feel uncanny to modern audiences. We expect beginnings to look crude. When they do not, we start inventing dramatic backstories. You pause near a workshop where a craftsperson shapes something with patient precision, and the ordinary miracle of skill becomes visible. Hands know what they are doing before theories arrive to explain them. Nearby, another worker repairs a wall. Someone hauls water. Someone shouts a complaint with enough spirit to suggest that civilization has always depended on people feeling underappreciated. The city hums with competence. This is not myth. This is the kind of accumulated know-how that turns a settlement into a centre. And yet, because you are following the relationship between Anunnaki and imagined Atlanteans, you keep noticing how later minds reinterpret competence as inheritance. If the gods in myth are associated with order, wisdomcraft, and civilizational structure, then monumental human achievements can start to look like evidence of divine tutoring. Add Atlantis into the mix, and the story becomes even more tempting. What if the great works of Sumer were not the first flowering of local innovation, but surviving echoes of a prior high culture now lost? What if the story is pointing at something else, some memory of building traditions older than the cities that preserved them? That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Archaeology suggests continuity, experimentation, and regional development rather than abrupt intrusion by a vanished, advanced power. There is no accepted line of evidence showing Atlantean engineers wandering the marshes offering unsolicited masonry advice. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin. But the emotional pull survives because monumental things do not like to feel ordinary. A temple platform wants a grand origin story. A well-planned city wants ancestors with impossible wisdom. Humans have never looked at an old wall and thought perhaps this was built by perfectly normal people with a decent work ethic. Historians still argue whether the earliest monumental phases of Mesopotamian urbanism should be understood mainly through economic coordination, religious centralization, ecological adaptation, or some combination of all three. That is a real scholarly debate, and it leaves plenty of room for interpretation without drifting into fantasy. The mainstream fact remains that Sumerian achievement is substantial and real. The interpretive angle is that later myths about lost golden ages may reflect the awe these early accomplishments inspire. The imagined mood is easy enough to enter: sunlight on brick, a city rising from the flat earth, temple walls catching the day. It does not take much for the mind to wonder whether greatness like this always has a deeper prelude. A popular rumour claims that all ancient monumental cultures inherited fragments from a single forgotten source civilization. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The clue here may actually point in the opposite direction. Perhaps the real mystery lies not in hidden origins, but in how readily later cultures underestimate the creativity of the ancient world. If we treat Atlantis as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then it may function more as a mirror of modern longing than a historical key. We want one grand answer because many smaller answers require patience, and patience is not humanity's leading export. The city continues around you in bright practical detail. Kilns radiate heat, clay tablets dry in stacks, tools scrape rope, creaks, sandals, scuff packed earth. There is no ocean here, no glittering marble harbour, no obvious sign of a drowned ancestral capital, and yet the imagination keeps making room for one, because the accomplishments before your eyes feel old enough to deserve legends. One interpretation is that this is exactly how Atlantean ideas attach themselves to Mesopotamia, not through evidence of direct contact, but through admiration transformed into myth. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Sumer built remarkable cities, temples, irrigation systems, and craft traditions through real human effort. The interpretation is that later readers, impressed by such early sophistication, search for an even older source behind it. The imagined part is the soft daydream that somewhere beyond the horizon of history, some older builders once also shaped earth and water with sacred confidence, and that the cities of Sumer, glowing under the morning sun, preserve not their blueprints, but the same ancient ambition to wrest order from a stubborn world. By midday, the heat begins to press down on the land with that flat, steady confidence only a river plain can manage. The city shimmers slightly at the edges, and the roads beyond it turn into lines of dust hoofprints and possibility. If the temples and canals taught you how Sumer organised itself at home, the trade routes teach you something equally important. It was never truly alone. Most historians agree that Mesopotamia was deeply connected to wider exchange networks, reaching across the Persian Gulf and into surrounding regions for raw materials, luxury goods, and practical necessities. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian cities depended on connections beyond their immediate landscape, because southern Mesopotamia, for all its brilliance, did not naturally provide everything a civilization might wish to show off with. You can see the logic immediately. Mud and reeds, yes. Grain, yes. Fish, yes. But stone for fine carving, timber for larger construction metals, for tools and prestige objects, shells, lapis and other valued materials, these often came from elsewhere. Archaeology suggests that from very early on, Mesopotamian communities participated in long-distance trade, especially through Gulf routes and overland connections that linked them to regions such as Dilmun Margan and Meluha in later textual traditions. The evidence we do have points to a world already tied together by movement, rumour exchange and the patient ambition of merchants. Civilization, once again, is not only priests and kings. It is also a person on a boat, hoping the cargo survives, and that no one at the next port suddenly invents an inconvenient tax. This matters to your question more than it might seem. One interpretation is that stories of distant lands, strange peoples, and valuable goods helped create the imaginative conditions in which legends of lost places could grow. If you live in a world where boats vanish over the horizon and return with things your home cannot produce, then distant geography already has a magical quality. A careful reading might suggest that maritime trade does not give you Atlantis directly, but it gives you something almost as powerful, the habit of believing that beyond the known shore lie richer, older, more mysterious places. That is excellent soil for legend. You walk in the thought toward a harbour zone or river landing where bundles are stacked jars sealed and men sweat over loading work that is neither glamorous nor optional. Rope fibres bite into the hands, wood creaks, water slaps against hulls. The smell is a mixture of mud, fish, tar-woven reeds, and human effort, which is to say the fragrance of global exchange in its earliest practical form. Somewhere a trader boasts with suspicious confidence. Somewhere else another trader pretends not to be worried, which is the traditional costume of merchants across all ages. Most historians agree that the Persian Gulf would have been a major corridor of connection, and that shoreline and maritime networks mattered deeply in the growth of Mesopotamian civilization. This is documented ground. But once you add the horizon, the imagination begins its usual acrobatics. A fringe idea proposes that repeated contact with coastal settlements, islands, and partially submerged landscapes may have fed later myths of drowned lands and remote wisdom centres. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is at least easier to imagine than some of the wilder alternatives, because trade really does move stories as efficiently as goods. Sailors do not merely transport cargo, they transport exaggeration with professional dedication. Historians still argue whether ancient legends of distant lands should be read mainly as practical geography, symbolic geography, literary idealization, or some blend of all three. That debate matters because port cultures are especially prone to narrative inflation. A place that begins as an island where we get copper can, after enough retellings, become a magnificent sea realm where the rulers wear impossible jewellery and everyone has suspiciously advanced spiritual insight. Human beings have always been remarkably willing to turn a shipping contact into a civilization myth by the third retelling. And that is where Atlantis starts to drift closer again, not as a proven destination, not as a confirmed partner of Sumer, but as the kind of grand maritime memory that a trade-connected civilization could easily imagine receive reshape or later be linked to by outside interpreters. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then perhaps the Atlantean flavour in later readings of Sumer arises partly from the Gulf itself, from real waterborne contact across a region where coastlines changed over time, and ancient communities may now lie buried or submerged beneath sediment and sea. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know trade happened. We know long-distance connections mattered. We know coastal and island places often develop oversized reputations in stories. What cannot be confirmed is that one of those remembered places was Atlantis, in any meaningful historical sense. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it remains thin. Yet the emotional bridge is not hard to cross. Water roots do something to the human imagination. They create edges, and once you have edges, you start inventing what lies beyond them. A popular rumour claims that Atlantis may have begun not as a continent-scale empire, but as memory distorted from real maritime societies, whose importance later grew in legend. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the clue here is refreshingly plausible. Maybe the origin of some drowned land myths is smaller, messier, and more human than the grand versions suggest. A port damaged by rising water, a wealthy island trade centre diminished by disaster, a shoreline holy place abandoned when the sea moved in. Over centuries, memory does what memory always does. It polishes, it merges, it dramatizes, Soon a network of ordinary but important places becomes one extraordinary lost world. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the relationship between the Anunnaki and imagined Atlanteans exists partly because Sumer itself lived in conversation with waterborne horizons? A civilization dependent on river mouths and gulf connections would naturally imagine sacred and valuable things arriving from beyond sight. Divine order might come from heaven in myth, but prestige goods, strange tales, and unusual ideas often arrived by boat. Between those two routes, sky and sea, an entire symbolic geography opens up. Gods descend, traders arrive, lost lands hover just beyond the map. You pause at the water's edge and watch sunlight flash across the surface. A boat pushes out slowly, burdened with goods and expectation. Another arrives low in the water, carrying materials whose sources most people inland will never see. The scene is practical, yet oddly dreamlike. The known world is touching the unknown in plain view, and no one here has time to be poetic about it because someone still has to unload the cargo. That is probably for the best. Too much poetry near a dock and nothing gets inventoried. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Sumer traded widely and depended on long-distance exchange through real routes across land and sea. The interpretation is that such networks helped nourish the idea of distant, half-understood places, rich in power or memory. The imagined part is the shimmering possibility that somewhere along those vanished shorelines, real communities once flourished close enough to the sea to be lost by it, and grand enough in recollection to become much later the sort of maritime ghost that people would eventually call Atlantis. The heat lingers into the afternoon, and as you follow the long arc of this story, something shifts. Until now, you have been walking inside Mesopotamia itself, among real cities, real tablets, real canals, real anxieties about water doing whatever it pleases. But now another figure enters the room much later from a very different world, Plato. Most historians agree that Atlantis appears most clearly in surviving literature through Plato's dialogues written in the 4th century BCE, long after the first Sumerian cities had risen, flourished, and passed into antiquity. What's broadly accepted is that Plato presents Atlantis as a powerful island society, destroyed after moral decline and catastrophic defeat, and that he uses the tale in a philosophical context rather than as straightforward historical reporting. That chronological gap matters immediately. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It matters a lot. If you are trying to draw a direct line from Sumerian text to Plato's Atlantis, you are not following a neat paved road. You are walking across centuries of cultural change, multiple languages, shifting empires, broken archives, and enough missing information to make any responsible historian reach for a calming beverage. The evidence we do have points to two very different traditions. On one side, Mesopotamian myths, king lists, flood stories, and divine genealogies. On the other, a Greek philosophical narrative about an idealized rival civilization that falls. There is no surviving clay tablet in Sumer saying, "Please keep this safe for Plato." And yet the comparison keeps happening because the mind loves patterns more than it loves chronology. One interpretation is that modern readers see resonances between these traditions because both deal in ancient greatness, divine association, catastrophe, and memory filtered through storytelling. A careful reading might suggest that the connection is less historical than structural. In both cases, you encounter a world partly veiled by distance, a people or power associated with exceptional order, and a sense that ruin separates the present from something earlier and more complete. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the relationship between the Anunnaki and Atlanteans may exist not in ancient archives, but in the architecture of myth itself. You can feel the difference in tone though. Sumerian tradition grows out of temple life, sacred kingship, floodplain, survival, and the long administrative memory of city-states. Plato's Atlantis arrives in a literary and philosophical framework reflecting Greek concerns about politics, virtue, hubris, and ideal societies. Most historians agree that this difference is crucial. Atlantis is not just a lost place in Plato, it is a moral and political device. The story contrasts a powerful but corrupt island civilization with a virtuous older Athens, shaping a lesson about order decline and the consequences of excess. A more cautious explanation could be that Atlantis says more about Greek philosophical imagination than about any preserved Bronze Age memory. Still, human beings are extremely talented at ignoring crucial differences when similarities are more exciting. A popular rumour claims that Plato must have drawn on very ancient traditions, perhaps Egyptian, perhaps older still, and that those traditions may ultimately reach back to the same deep source that shaped flood myths and divine descent stories in Mesopotamia. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it feels elegant. One source, many echoes, God's floods, lost cities, vanished wisdom, all arranged like a neat little conspiracy board. Historians still argue whether Plato borrowed from older traditions in any meaningful historical way, or whether Atlantis was largely his own crafted narrative using familiar motifs. That debate will probably outlive several of us. You rest in the shade of a courtyard wall in your imagination, and the day seems to pause between two worlds. The clay world of Sumer remains around you heavy with heat-grain dust and the smell of sun-warmed brick. But drifting over it now is the sea-lit image of Atlantis from a later age, with its rings of water and land, its engineered beauty, its grandeur, already doomed by moral imbalance. The two worlds do not match neatly, yet one interpretation is that later readers bring them together because both satisfy the same old appetite for beginnings that feel larger than life. People do not merely want origins, they want prestigious origins, preferably with architecture. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real link between Plato and the Sumerians is not a hidden chain of transmission, but a shared human instinct to imagine the earliest worlds as richer, more ordered and more terrifyingly fragile than the present? In Sumer, divine beings and flood memories surround the rise of civilization. In Plato, Atlantis embodies power before collapse. The same emotional rhythm appears in both. Greatness first, disaster after, lesson always. Humanity, it seems, enjoys telling itself that the old world was magnificent right until it made one fatal mistake. A surprisingly relatable pattern, honestly. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. What's broadly accepted is that Plato wrote much later than the Sumerians, and that there is no accepted direct textual bridge between Atlantis and the Anunnaki. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin. But the interpretive temptation remains powerful because the themes align just enough to feel like they should belong together. Flood, sacred order, lost greatness, a break in time, a surviving memory that may be more symbolic than literal. Once those pieces are on the table, later ages begin arranging them into one giant ancestral puzzle, whether the sources approve or not. A fringe idea proposes that Plato's Atlantis preserves an echo transformed almost beyond recognition of far older, Near Eastern stories that moved westward across the centuries. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Cultural motifs do travel, and ancient Mediterranean worlds were not sealed boxes but specific proof. Here is hard to pin down. A careful reading might suggest that similarities can emerge because societies confronting power, water, and loss often tell stories in comparable ways. You do not always need direct borrowing for mythic cousins to resemble one another. Sometimes human fears are just repetitive with excellent costume design. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know Sumerian traditions are older. We know Plato gives Atlantis its most famous surviving shape. We know later readers fuse them because the fusion feels emotionally satisfying. What we cannot confirm is whether that satisfaction reflects deep historical memory or simply the human talent for elegant overconnection. Somewhere between those two possibilities, the story continues to breathe. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Plato and Sumer belong to different times, different languages, and different literary purposes. The interpretation is that modern readers connect them through shared themes of divine order, catastrophe, and lost greatness. The imagined part is the soft afternoon vision that as stories cross seas and centuries, fragments of old floodplain anxieties and old temple grandeur may have drifted outward into the Mediterranean mind, until much later they returned wearing a new Greek name and the shimmering outline of Atlantis. The afternoon begins to loosen at the edges, and with that softening light the story shifts again, this time not deeper into the ancient world itself, but into the strange modern afterlife of that world. Because whatever the Anunnaki meant to the Sumerians, they have come to mean something else entirely to many people now. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian texts do not describe Atlantis in any direct or broadly accepted way, and they do not present the Anunnaki as a lost oceanic civilization. What's broadly accepted is that the modern image of the Anunnaki has been heavily reshaped by recent speculative books, documentaries, online theories, and the very human desire to turn old gods into something that sounds like a secret you were not supposed to hear. You can almost watch it happen. The clay tablets survive. The words are translated, argued over, refined, revised. Scholars do the slow and admirable work of reading difficult texts in difficult languages, usually without theme music. Then later, modern imagination arrives like an enthusiastic guest who is invited to tea and immediately starts redecorating the house. Divine beings become hidden rulers. Mythic descent becomes technological arrival. Sacred order becomes external intervention. And before long, the Anunnaki are no longer just ancient deities in a complex religious tradition. They are reintroduced to the public as culture bringers, engineers, sky beings, or mysterious elites tied to everything from human origins to lost civilizations. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki ruled not only Sumer, but also Atlantis, or that both belonged to the same forgotten global age before catastrophe erased the evidence. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it spreads easily because it offers a grand simplification. Instead of many ancient cultures developing in their own complicated ways, you get one sweeping origin story, one master puzzle, one ancient network. Human beings adore this kind of compression. Give us 1,000 years of messy local development and we yawn. Give us one vanished super civilization with divine management issues and suddenly everyone sits up. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The evidence we do have points to the Anunnaki as part of ancient Mesopotamian religious language, not as a coded historical record of Atlantean administrators. Scholars continue to debate details of divine roles, textual variation, and changing meanings across time. But that is very different from saying the tablets secretly document a sunken sea empire. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here it is not just thin, it is more like a decorative fog wearing expensive jewellery. Still, the fog tells you something useful. One interpretation is that the modern merging of Anunnaki and Atlanteans reveals a deep pattern in how people handle antiquity. They do not merely want old stories, they want old stories to connect. They want Egypt to talk to Sumer, Sumer, to talk to Atlantis, Atlantis, to talk to the stars and the stars to talk back in a voice that sounds just mysterious enough to justify a documentary thumbnail. The modern imagination dislikes isolated myths. It wants a universe, preferably one with ominous background music, and at least one glowing map. As you sit in the shade of this long afternoon, you begin to notice that Atlantis has become, in modern thought, less a place than a storage box. Everything uncertain gets placed inside it. Unexplained engineering, flood memory, missing knowledge, moral collapse, lost science, spiritual secrets. It is the attic of historical longing, and the Anunnaki in some fringe retellings serve a similar function. They become the answer people reach for whenever ancient civilization feels too early, too impressive, or too symbolically charged to leave alone. A fringe idea proposes that if two ancient mysteries both seem large enough, then surely they must belong to the same hidden chapter. This theory isn't widely accepted, but emotionally it is very efficient. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these merged theories comes mostly from mistranslation, selective reading, distrust of mainstream history, or simply the timeless appeal of a dramatic origin story. That debate matters because modern Anunnaki mythology is not really an ancient artifact. It is a modern cultural creation built from fragments of genuine antiquity combined with speculation, reinterpretation, and a certain cheerful disrespect for context. That does not make it meaningless. It simply means the meaning belongs more to us than to the Sumerians. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the relationship between the Anunnaki and Atlanteans tells you less about ancient reality and more about modern hunger? Hunger for unity, hunger for hidden pattern, hunger for a past that feels vast enough to explain why the present feels fractured. A careful reading might suggest that these blended myths comfort people because they reduce complexity. Instead of many beginnings, one beginning. Instead of many disasters, one disaster. Instead of many traditions, one forgotten source. It is tidy. History infuriatingly usually is not. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia deserves to be understood in its own texture, temple economies, divine hierarchies, floodplain, ecology, local politics, changing myths, evolving texts. That world is already rich enough. Atlantis likewise has its own literary and philosophical setting in Greek thought. But modern retellings like to dissolve the walls between traditions, because boundaries frustrate grand narratives. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then perhaps the modern marriage of Anunnaki and Atlanteans works not because it is historically persuasive, but because it feels mythically symmetrical. Sky-linked beings above, sea-linked civilization below. Between them, humanity receiving gifts, warnings, or consequences. You hear the city again around you in imagination, though. Now it is mixed with voices from much later ages. The scratch of stylus on clay blends with the turning pages of modern paperbacks. The glow of screens, the murmured confidence of narrators promising revelations just beyond the next chapter. The old gods have become portable. They travel badly sometimes, but they travel well. One interpretation is that every era rebuilds ancient myths in its own image. The Sumerians saw divine order in a river world of temples and kings. Modern audiences living among global networks and fractured certainties often recast those same figures as agents in a lost planetary drama. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but the modern imagination has undeniably changed the cast. The Anunnaki, once rooted in specific texts and sacred contexts, now wander through broader narratives about Atlantis, prehistory, hidden knowledge, and civilizational collapse. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And also, if we are being slightly honest with ourselves, in what we keep insisting on combining, like overconfident cooks, adding every spice in the cabinet. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the ancient texts do not directly link the Anunnaki to Atlantis. The interpretation is that modern readers fuse them, because both serve as symbols of lost origins and unsettling greatness. The imagined part is the soft, late afternoon sense that perhaps the real power of these theories lies not in uncovering a buried fact, but in revealing how badly people want the oldest stories on Earth to belong to one enormous half-drowned family. The afternoon thins toward evening, and the city's bright edges begin to soften again. Heat still clings to the brick, but shadows lengthen across courtyards and temple walls, and with that gentler light your way of reading changes too. You are no longer asking only what the old texts say. You are asking how they ought to be read, when later centuries keep trying to load them with cargo they were never designed to carry. Most historians agree that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian texts are complex religious, political and literary works, shaped by context, not transparent windows, into a hidden prehistoric master narrative. What's broadly accepted is that careful reading matters because ancient stories are often symbolic, layered and deeply tied to the worlds that produced them. You sit in imagination near a stack of clay tablets, each one small enough to hold dense enough to outlast empires and frustrating enough to remind you that ancient texts rarely hand over their meaning without a fight. A scribe presses signs into damp clay with practiced speed. He is not thinking about modern debates over Atlantis. He's thinking about getting the sign order right, because errors in sacred or administrative writing are the sort of thing that can ruin a person's day in very enduring ways. The evidence we do have points to a written culture deeply concerned with ritual precision, inherited formula, and preserving relationships between gods, rulers' offerings and order. One interpretation is that when later readers ignore that texture, they begin turning myth into code. That is where the mist gets thickest. A popular rumour claims that if a text sounds symbolic, then it must be concealing technical or historical information under the surface, as though ancient priests spent their evenings hiding submarine blueprints inside hymns. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because symbols feel like locked doors, and people enjoy assuming every locked door hides a spectacular secret. Sometimes a symbol really is pointing towards something layered or elusive, but a more cautious explanation could be that symbolic language is simply how ancient cultures handled realities too large, sacred, unstable, or emotionally charged to describe in flat prose. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are best read first within Mesopotamian frameworks. Divine descent, sacred kingship, flood narratives, cosmic struggle, and creation scenes all belong to a religious world that makes sense on its own terms. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence for Atlantis hiding inside these texts remains thin, very thin. So thin that if it were a piece of woven cloth, you would not trust it near a strong breeze. Yet the appeal remains because once modern readers suspect that old myths are encoded memory, every poetic detail begins to look like a clue. Historians still argue whether particular myths should be read mainly as ritual narrative, political theology, etiological explanation, literary tradition, or combinations of all of these. That exact phrase belongs here because the debate is real and worth honouring. Ancient texts are not simplistic. They can preserve older materials, shift emphasis across time, and gather meanings the original tellers may never have fully controlled. A careful reading might suggest that this very instability is what invites later overreading. If a god can be cosmic in one text, local in another, and symbolic in a third, then imaginative readers start slipping entire lost continents through the cracks. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the task is not to decode Atlantis from the tablets, but to recognise that myth itself is a kind of memory engine? Not memory in the neat modern sense of dates and coordinates, but memory of fears, patterns, values, disasters and desired order. Flood myths may preserve the emotional truth of vulnerability. Divine assemblies may preserve the emotional truth of dependence on higher powers. Sacred cities may preserve the emotional truth that beginnings feel holier when they are imagined from a distance. In that sense, the old texts are not hiding modern secrets. They are openly preserving ancient feeling. You watch the evening light slide over the clay surfaces, and they seem almost alive, warm at the edges, dark in the impressions. It becomes easier now to see why later readers reach too far. The tablets feel authoritative. Ancient writing has that effect. Even when it is fragmentary, disputed, and annoyingly context-bound, it radiates the aura of deep source material. A fringe idea proposes that if the oldest texts carry so much symbolic weight, then surely they must preserve the memory of a real earlier world beyond what scholars admit. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it expresses a recognisable hope that literature can function as a time capsule more faithful than history. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Some ancient stories may indeed contain dim echoes of environmental change, political trauma, or inherited traditions whose earliest layers are hard to reconstruct. But that is different from saying they secretly describe Atlanteans in ceremonial language. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we cannot confirm sometimes attracts more devotion than what is documented, because the undefined can be furnished to taste. Most historians agree that the strongest approach is patient reading. Start with the language. Start with the culture. Start with what the text is doing in its own world. Then, and only then, ask whether broader comparisons are useful. One interpretation is that when you read this way, the Anunnaki become more interesting, not less. They are not flattened into sci-fi overlords or sea kings in disguise. They remain shifting divine presences tied to judgment order and sacred hierarchy in a civilization learning how to write itself into permanence. That is already wondrous enough to deserve your attention without imported glitter. And still the Atlantean shadow hovers, because comparison is one of the mind's favourite games. Lost land, lost age, lost wisdom, lost order. Those themes travel well. If we treat Atlantis as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then perhaps it works best here as a modern metaphor for the temptation to overconnect ancient fragments. The tablets do not need Atlantis to be mysterious, but Atlantis offers later readers a ready-made emotional frame for reading mystery as memory and absence as evidence. That frame is seductive. It turns fragments into prophecy and silence into suggestion. You hear the quiet sounds of evening around the archive. Someone covers stored goods. Someone closes a door. A temple singer rehearses a line low under the breath. The city is becoming gentle again. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that ancient Mesopotamian texts must be read within their own religious and historical settings. The interpretation is that symbolic stories may preserve emotional or cultural memory without preserving literal hidden history. The imagined part is the soft twilight thought that maybe the old tablets are not maps to Atlantis at all, but mirrors reflecting back the same thing every age brings to them, its own longing for a lost beginning, grand enough to explain the ache of not knowing. Evening settles more completely now, and the old city begins to glow at the edges instead of glaring. The heat lifts just enough to make breathing feel like less of a personal challenge. And with the softer air comes the larger question that has been waiting behind everything else. Why does this theory persist? Not merely why it exists, because human beings can create a theory out of fog coincidence and one suspiciously shaped rock if sufficiently motivated, but why this particular pairing endures? Why the Anunnaki? Why Atlantis? Why do these two ancient magnets keep pulling toward one another in the modern imagination, as though they belong to the same half-drowned constellation? Most historians agree that people in many times and places have imagined earlier civilizations as wiser, stronger, more sacred, or more complete than the present. What's broadly accepted is that Golden Age thinking is one of humanity's favourite habits. The farther back the past recedes, the more polished it becomes. Early kings grow taller, priests grow wiser, builders become more precise, moral failures become more dramatic, cities become cleaner than they probably were, which is perhaps the boldest fantasy of all. One interpretation is that Atlantis and the Anunnaki endure together because both allow modern people to project this Golden Age longing onto very ancient settings. You feel that longing even here in the quiet streets. The city around you is ordinary in so many visible ways. Clay dust, work tools, cooking smoke storage jars, tired backs, cracked brick, and the constant little negotiations required to keep collective life from turning into organised chaos. Yet above that ordinary surface hover the myths: divine descent, sacred cities, flood memory, lost worlds. A careful reading might suggest that what draws people to these stories is not simply the promise of hidden information, but the promise that the beginning was meaningful in a way the present often struggles to be. Atlantis offers grandeur. The Anunnaki offer cosmic relevance. Put them together and you get a past that feels not only old but important on purpose. A fringe idea proposes that ancient people really were heirs to a far greater global civilization, and that fragments of this inheritance survive in myths, rituals, sacred architecture, and scattered symbols. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it flatters a certain emotional need. If the earliest stories preserve the ruins of a lost perfection, then the confusion of history becomes easier to bear. Decline replaces randomness. Forgetting replaces failure. You are not living in a world that never fully makes sense. You are living after a break, after a fall, after the memory of something better dimmed. There is comfort in that, even if the evidence remains stubbornly incomplete. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian civilization emerging from the local development, regional exchange, environmental adaptation, and evolving religious traditions. Atlantis as a named literary construct comes much later in Greek thought. There is no accepted historical proof tying them together as one lost global system. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and it remains thin. But theories do not survive on evidence alone. They survive on emotional usefulness. That may be the most important clue of all. Historians still argue whether the appeal of ancient lost civilization theories comes mainly from dissatisfaction with modern life, romanticism about the past, distrust of institutions, or the sheer narrative pleasure of elegant, big answers. The truth may be some blend of all of them. Big theories soothe the mind. They turn scattered facts into a single mural. They reduce complexity. They make history feel designed rather than improvised. Atlantis is excellent at this. The Anunnaki are also excellent at this. Separately, they each promise hidden order. Together, they promise a complete backstage pass. You sit near the doorway of a house as lamps are lit one by one in the deepening dusk. Somewhere nearby, bread is baking, and the smell moves warmly through the air. Someone laughs. Someone argues. A child complains with the full dramatic commitment children have brought to civilization since the beginning. The reality of life is local, immediate, repetitive, but myth opens above it like a second ceiling. One interpretation is that people attach themselves to ancient mysteries because the present feels too cramped without them. If the world began in splendour and secrecy, then your own life participates, however faintly, in a larger drama. That is a generous kind of consolation. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the persistence of this theory tells you less about ancient transmission and more about the emotional architecture of memory? Water sky gods, drowned lands, sacred origins, lost wisdom. These are not random motifs. They gather around one central ache that what matters most seems to lie just out of reach before history, beyond the horizon, beneath the surface, above the world. Always one layer deeper than the facts can comfortably follow. Atlantis and the Anunnaki endure because they are both machines for producing depth. Most historians agree that myths often survive because they answer needs no archive can settle. They explain vulnerability, they frame catastrophe, they dignify beginnings, they allow cultures to imagine that order came from somewhere greater than themselves. A more cautious explanation could be that the Anunnaki-Atlantean connection persists simply because both are vague enough to absorb endless reinterpretation. Vague ancient things have an extraordinary career advantage. The less fixed they are, the more people can move into them with furniture. A popular rumour claims that the truth has been deliberately hidden, that the connection is obvious once you stop trusting conventional scholarship. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here may be humbler. Perhaps the theory persists because it is built from emotional truths wrapped around historical uncertainty. People really do feel that civilization has forgotten something. People really do fear collapse. People really do suspect that power once came clothed in sacred language. When those feelings meet ancient names, the result is very hard to let go of. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. But as the evening deepens and the old city glows under the first returning stars, you can sense why the pairing lasts. The Anunnaki belong to one of the oldest written worlds. Atlantis belongs to one of the most famous lost worlds. One is written in clay, one is imagined through water, one feels rooted, one feels unreachable. Together they create a perfect tension between evidence and longing, and the human mind adores that tension almost as much as it adores pretending it has resolved it. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that human beings repeatedly invent golden ages and connect ancient mysteries across cultures. The interpretation is that the Anunnaki and Atlantis endure together because they serve the same desire for lost origins and hidden order. The imagined part is the quiet evening thought that perhaps every civilization carries somewhere under its official story a secret homesickness. For a beginning it never actually knew, yet keeps trying to rediscover in the oldest names it can find. Night returns fully now, and with it the air becomes softer, almost forgiving, as though the land itself has decided you have earned a quieter pace. The canals darken into ribbons of ink. Lamps flicker behind walls. The stars, patient and aloof, begin once more to look down on a world still thinking about water. That feels right, because this part of the puzzle has always belonged to water and memory. Archaeology suggests that coastlines and waterways changed dramatically over long spans of prehistory and history, and that communities in low-lying regions could be displaced, diminished, or entirely erased by the slow or sudden movement of water. What's broadly accepted is that human beings really did lose habitats, shorelines, and familiar landscapes as environments shifted. One interpretation is that some myths of drowned worlds may preserve the emotional shape of those losses. And what if Atlantis survives not as a place with a mailing address, but as the feeling left behind when the sea takes something people cannot bear to forget? You can imagine such a place without over-decorating it. Not necessarily a marble-ringed wonder city with theatrical lighting and dramatically disappointed priests, but a coastline where real people once lived, traded, fished, prayed and buried their dead. A settlement low enough to prosper beside the water and low enough to fear it. A shrine near a tidal inlet. A cluster of houses built where the land seemed stable until it was not. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth that is easy to overlook because it lacks a proper soundtrack. Ancient communities often lived close to vulnerable water edges. Over generations, rising seas silting erosion storms, river shifts and marsh expansion could change everything. Most historians agree that after the last ice age rising, sea levels transformed coastlines on a global scale, although connecting any one myth directly to those events remains difficult and deeply debated. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The environmental reality is solid. The mythic linkage is not. Historians still argue whether stories of drowned lands preserve very ancient inherited memories, later local disasters, symbolic theology, or a blend of all three. That uncertainty matters because it keeps you balanced. One foot remains on documented ground. The other touches the mist only gently. Still, the attraction is strong. A careful reading might suggest that people do not need exact coordinates to preserve catastrophe. They preserve mood, absence, the strange sensation that a known world is gone, and that those who come later must live inland from memory. That is why water legends haunt so effectively. Fire destroys in front of you. Water destroys and then conceals. It leaves a surface. It invites imagination to populate what lies below. The ocean and the marsh are both masters of this trick. They do not merely erase, they make you wonder. And once you are wondering, the Anunnaki drift back into view. Not because they arrive in a text announcing jurisdiction over a submerged empire, but because Mesopotamian divine stories already live close to the themes of order, catastrophe, sacred beginnings, and the uneasy relationship between humanity and powerful forces beyond its control. One interpretation is that modern readers sense a kinship between these stories and Atlantis because both are built around a vanished centre of meaning. A lost order, a broken world, a before and after. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then perhaps the relationship is emotional before it is historical. You walk now in your mind beyond the city and toward the darker wetlands, where the boundary between land and water turns uncertain under moonlight. Reeds murmur. Frogs resume their small, endless declarations. Mud gives a little underfoot. Somewhere out there, the plain dissolves into channels and hidden pools, and the whole region begins to feel like a lesson in impermanence. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the oldest flood and drowned land traditions are less about one lost place, and more about the recurring human experience of watching reliable geography become unreliable? Nothing unsettles people quite like discovering the horizon has changed without asking permission. A fringe idea proposes that a real drowned civilization once existed somewhere within the broader ancient world, perhaps not as vast or ornate as later legends claim, but significant enough that memories of it diffused into many traditions, including those that later attached themselves to the Anunnaki and Atlantis. This theory isn't widely accepted, but compared with some of the wilder options, it at least respects the fact that landscapes do vanish, and people do remember loss imperfectly. A more cautious explanation could be that many communities across many times experienced local forms of submergence and displacement, and that myth gathered these separate sorrows into larger stories because large stories are easier to carry. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Archaeology suggests changeable coastlines, not confirmed Atlantean ports. Sediment sea rise marsh expansion and shifting rivers are all real. What is not confirmed is a single drowned mother civilization standing behind every ancient memory of water. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here, as before, it remains thin. But thin evidence is not the same as no reason for wonder. Sometimes the most enduring legends are built not from one dramatic fact, but from many ordinary tragedies wearing the same mask. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know landscapes disappeared. We know settlements can be lost. We know memory reshapes loss into narrative. We know ancient cultures repeatedly told stories in which water becomes the agent of rupture between the old world and the new. That much is enough to explain why Atlantis continues to feel plausible to the imagination even when history will not certify it. Water leaves behind emotional evidence long after physical evidence goes under. A popular rumour claims that every major civilization secretly remembers Atlantis somewhere in its oldest myths. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here may be both sadder and more beautiful. Perhaps what cultures remember is not one shared city, but one shared vulnerability. The sea rises, the river shifts, the harbour silts, the shrine floods, the ancestral graves disappear. Children grow up hearing there was once more land beyond the reeds, once more houses near that shore, once a town where boats no longer go. A few generations later, the story has become dignified. A few more, and it has become sacred. Most historians agree that myth often gives loss a shape the heart can bear. That may be why drowned land stories endure. They do not merely describe geography, they promise that what vanished still matters enough to be named. In that sense, Atlantis functions almost like a title bestowed on grief. And the Anunnaki, standing in the oldest literate traditions as guardians, judges, or powers of cosmic order, become part of the same emotional framework in modern imagination. Great forces preside. A world is lost. Memory remains. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is one of the gentler explanations, and therefore one of the more compelling. The city behind you breathes quietly in the night. The wetlands ahead breathe quietly too. Between them stands the whole human problem of trying to remember what water removed. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that ancient landscapes changed, and vulnerable communities could be erased by shifting water. The interpretation is that myths of drowned worlds may preserve the emotional truth of those disappearances. The imagined part is the moonlit thought that perhaps Atlantis was never one place waiting to be found, but the name later ages gave to the universal ache of looking across dark water and feeling with impossible certainty that something important used to be there. The night has grown deep and kind now, the sort of night in which even difficult questions begin to soften around the edges. The city rests behind you in low lamplight and sleeping courtyards. The canals hold the stars in trembling fragments. Somewhere a reed bed rustles as if the land itself is whispering in its sleep. And here at the end of this long walk through clay flood kingship skytrade and memory, you return to the simplest and hardest part of the story. Solid ground and open sea. What can actually be said and what must remain a possibility? Most historians agree that Sumerian civilization stands on its own as one of the great achievements of the ancient world. What's broadly accepted is that the people of southern Mesopotamia built cities, temples, administrative systems, sacred traditions, and written records through local development, long adaptation to a difficult environment, and generations of very human labour. Archaeology suggests that their world does not require Atlantis to explain it. The evidence we do have points to real canal systems, real temple platforms, real evolving myths, real kings, real trade routes, and real attempts to understand a universe that could feel generous one season and impossible the next. That matters because the oldest clay deserves the dignity of being read before it is recruited into later fantasies. A careful reading might suggest that the Anunnaki belong first to a Mesopotamian religious landscape, not to a hidden planetary empire. Their roles shift across texts and periods, but they remain grounded in the sacred language of gods, order, judgment, and cosmic structure. Atlantis, by contrast, enters surviving literature most famously through Plato in a much later Greek setting, with philosophical concerns of its own. That is documented ground. Two traditions, different times, different purposes, different waters, if you like. And yet one interpretation is that the Anunnaki-Atlantean connection survives because it expresses something emotionally true even if it remains historically unproven. The Sumerian world gives you divine origins, sacred cities, flood memory, and the sense that civilization began under a shadow larger than itself. Atlantis gives you a lost greatness beyond the shore, a civilization swallowed by moral and watery catastrophe. Put them together, and you get a story-shaped machine for thinking about beginnings and loss, not one hidden truth, a puzzle, an open question, a deeply human arrangement of symbols around a feeling that history used to know more than it now admits. Historians still argue whether the strongest similarities between these traditions arise from direct transmission of old motifs from recurring human responses to catastrophe and memory, or from modern readers weaving separate ancient stories into one larger tapestry. That debate will not be settled tonight, and perhaps it never should be. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and the direct evidence for a literal historical relationship between the Anunnaki and Atlanteans remains thin, very thin. The mainstream case is that no such relationship can be confirmed. The more speculative case is that themes of flood-lost order, divine authority and ancient prestige may have encouraged later generations to connect them. That's a possibility, not a certainty. What if the stories are pointing at something else? What if the most haunting relationship between them is not one of contact descent or hidden alliance, but one of function? The Anunnaki in the old texts stand near the origins of cosmic and civic order. Atlantis in later legend stands near the origins of civilizational longing that ache for a lost world grander than the present. One is written in clay, one is imagined through the sea, one feels historical even in its myth, one feels mythical even when people try to historicize it. Together they frame the oldest human suspicion of all, that what was first was somehow richer, holier, and more complete, and that time since then has been partly a long forgetting. You stand now at the edge of the city and the water together where the air smells faintly of mud, cool reeds, smoke and distance. A boat is tied somewhere in the dark, knocking softly against wood. The temple rises behind you as a darker shape against the stars. Ahead is the black shimmer of channels leading outward toward marsh and gulf, toward worlds known and half-known, toward all the stories that travel more easily over water than over land. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That has been true all along. But perhaps the deeper truth is, this uncertainty is not a flaw in stories like these. It is their atmosphere. A fringe idea proposes that one forgotten civilizational source lies behind both the Anunnaki tradition and Atlantis, a memory broken into fragments by flood migration and the limits of human recollection. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less a claim than a mood. A way of imagining the oldest world as once connected by sacred knowledge, coastal settlements, sky watching, and the shared danger of water. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient cultures faced with similar fears and hopes created similar story patterns without needing one literal hidden source. Both views tell you something. One tells you what people wish had happened. The other tells you how people repeatedly cope with the same kinds of uncertainty. Most historians agree that the strongest path is humility. Read the tablets carefully, respect the chronology, distinguish between documented history and later interpretation. Keep the solid ground separate from the mist, but do not assume the mist is meaningless. Myths matter precisely because they gather the emotions that facts alone cannot hold. Floods destroy more than buildings. They destroy continuity. Lost cities are not only geographical puzzles, they are emotional ones. The oldest texts do not need to contain Atlantis to illuminate why Atlantis exists as an idea. And Atlantis does not need to be historically real to show why people keep looking backward through water in search of a beginning worthy of their longing. So where do you finally land tonight? On the riverbank, perhaps, or at the marsh edge, somewhere between clay and tide? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Sumer was real brilliant, difficult, and old beyond easy comparison. The interpretation is that later ages linked its gods and flood memories to the dream of Atlantis, because both traditions circle loss, power, and origin. The imagined part is the last quiet possibility that somewhere in the first human encounters with rising water and sacred order, the seed of both stories was planted, not as a map to a hidden empire, but as a permanent human instinct, to believe that the world once began nearer to the gods and nearer to the sea. And now the pace can slow. The city grows quieter still. The frogs take over the soundtrack with complete professional confidence. Wind moves across the reeds in long, soft breaths. The stars above ancient Mesopotamia are the same stars above every coast that ever feared the water, every harbour that ever watched a shoreline change, every temple that ever lifted prayers into the dark, hoping for stability in a world that could not promise it. You do not need to solve the mystery tonight. You only need to let it drift. Let the names settle first. Sumer, Eridu, Enki, Anunnaki, Atlantis, Plato, flood, clay, water. Each one can rest where it is without forcing the others into a shape they may not fully fit. The old world is allowed to remain partially veiled. In fact, that is often where it is most beautiful. Picture the canal one last time, still under the night sky, holding broken reflections of stars that no hand can gather completely. Picture the temple quiet, now its bricks cooling after the heat of day. Picture the marsh beyond, black and silver, breathing in the dark. Somewhere out there is history. Somewhere out there is memory. Somewhere out there is imagination doing what it has always done, laying gentle bridges between what is known and what is only hoped. If there was ever a lost world behind these stories, it is at peace now. If there was not, the longing itself is still real, and perhaps that has always been enough. So let the water go still. Let the clay rest. Let the oldest questions remain old. And let the night close softly over the reeds, the temples, the ruined shorelines, and the half-remembered worlds that humans keep building out of longing, one story at a time.